Yeah.
Hi, we've got an event starting. Just
That's
a moment.
what I'm looking for, yeah.
Expert on computers, okay. Well, yeah, yeah.
All right, we're gonna get going here, I think.
Okay, yep.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Rowan Neufeld. I'm the events coordinator for McNally Robinson Booksellers in Saskatoon. Tonight's event is coming to you live from Treaty 6 territory, the traditional lands of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and Métis nations. So special thanks to anyone who is watching from the live stream. And for those of you who are in person, thanks for being here. Out of an abundance of caution, we just ask that you keep your masks on for the duration of the event. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Saskatoon launch of From Left to Right, Saskatchewan's Political and Economic Transformation by Dale Eisler. So thank you to Dale Eisler for being here with us. I'd also like to thank the University of Regina Press for working with us on tonight's event. So in just a moment, we'll hear Mr. Eisler talk about the book, and that'll be followed by a brief Q&A and a book signing. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the author. Dale Eisler spent 16 years in senior positions within the Canadian federal government, including Assistant Secretary to Cabinet with the Privy Council Office. He's been the Assistant Deputy Minister and Consul General for Canada in Denver. And before joining the government, Eisler spent 26 years working as a journalist, and this is his fourth book. Please join me in welcoming Dale Eisler.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. I appreciate you coming out. I don't know about you, but it feels good after 2 years not being in my pajamas. Finally. I think all I ever wore for almost 2 years was pajamas and a house coat, because you almost never left the house, which actually was part of the motivation for this book. I suddenly felt I had some time on my hands, some an opportunity at least to write. I try to talk about this subject, write about this subject, because it had been on my mind for a few years. As Ronan mentioned, I had been a journalist for many years in Saskatchewan. I left in the mid-1990s. I used to work with Dan, who was Zakreski, who was with us tonight, and CBC at the Star Phoenix. And when I came back about 8 years ago, I was really surprised about sort of the transformation that occurred in Saskatchewan, both politically and economically, from the province I left to the one that we have today. And I was, sort of fascinated by this and thought it was something worth to think about and maybe write about. And I sort of felt too it was maybe one of the more interesting, if not the most interesting story actually in Canadian politics. How did Saskatchewan go from being a province that was sort of widely regarded our friends from the Saskatchewan Party, Rob Norris and Ken Cheveldayoff are here too. And I think they would agree that Saskatchewan was, seen as very much had a history of what some might say a socialist background, certainly social democratic. This was sort of the identity Saskatchewan had across Canada, in some ways in North America. I mean, 1944, Saskatchewan became the first jurisdiction in North America to elect a democratic socialist government in 1944 when Tommy Douglas came to power. So that was kind of the origins of it. And the NDP CCF-NDP was in power for 20 years, had deep roots in the province, rurally and in the cities. And, went through some political cycles where the Liberals were in power in the 70s, or the 60s, that is, Ross Thatcher from 64 to 71, and the Blakeney government, NDP government of the 70s into the early 80s, which I think had quite a strong sort of presence and identity across Canada as quite a social democratic government, use crown corporations as a means of economic development in a very big way in terms of the resources of the province. And then we had the Divine government, which was, progressive conservative, and I think stunned many people in the province with their election victory in 1982 that defeated the Blakeney government, which had, pretty sound sort of fiscal record at least. And the Divine government was elected on what I think you could describe as a pretty populist agenda. Anyways, go through these cycles, and ultimately we end up where we are today, where the Saskatchewan Party is really the dominant political force in the province. I mean, has a stranglehold, it would appear, certainly electorally in the province, is the party of rural Saskatchewan without question. And, this is an area of the province where the NDP once had significant roots. So anyways, it all, to me, was a very, very interesting story. So I thought, I'm going to try to think about this and write about it. Then the question became, so where do you begin with this? Because as I say in the book, there's no beginning and end to history. Everything is all interrelated. So I decided, and it became kind of almost like a personal journey in a sense, reflecting my adult life. I came of age in 1968 in terms of, age of majority. I was 18 years old. And 1968, I remember quite vividly for a lot of good reasons, and many others here, my vintage will remember too. That was a really pivotal year in terms of North America and spilled over into Canada. But, it was the year that Martin Luther King was assassinated. Bobby Kennedy was assassinated in the United States. You had the race riots of the summer of 1968, the Democratic Convention, which was tremendous upheaval. You had the Vietnam War, the Tet Offensive of that year. I mean, these were huge, huge events that were going on in kind of the public arena. And I was, just coming of age and kind of really captured my imagination. And concurrently at the same time, 1968 was the year that Pierre Trudeau came on the scene in Canada, and we had Trudeau mania. One of my one recollection I have is 1968, actually in Regina, in the midst of that election in June 1968, the Liberals were having an event it was actually in Wascana Park in Regina, a beautiful summer evening, and just the height of Trudeau mania, and it's a huge crowd. So I went out just sort of curious about this, and I was just sort of struck by how people were so, excited by this, political figure of Trudeau at the time, and it just so from that, that's really what got me engaged in politics and went on into journalism and whatnot later on. So anyways, so I kind of use the late 60s as a starting point for this book. And what I attempt to do is to identify and describe what I guess I could just call moments in time from that period of the late 60s through to today, and how each of these in one fashion or another are interrelated, and how they shaped Saskatchewan politics and the outcomes that we have today. And so it's a story that in many respects is much bigger than Saskatchewan. Sort of the contours of the book are, I open with what I call as a prologue, which is the election of 1982, the evening of April 26, 1982, when the Divine Government was elected, which was a really kind of major event in Saskatchewan politics because it was such a stunning victory for the Progressive Conservatives. Not so much that they won. I think there was certain, after three terms in power, it's not unusual for a government to be defeated, but the scope of the defeat was really quite something. So I say to understand, how that happened, you kind of had to look before and after. And I go back to the late 60s and come forward from there. And I have a chapter on populism, the importance of populism in Saskatchewan and the history of Saskatchewan, the political history of Saskatchewan, and how the CCF-NDP, certainly the CCF, was very much a populist movement, agrarian populism under Tommy Douglas, and that this spirit of populism is something that's very much still alive in Saskatchewan, below the surface often, but it cannot be ignored, and it's a very important factor in Saskatchewan politics. So I talk about that, and then I go to I talk about this era of essentially 60, the late 60s to the late 90s, and just in that period talk about sort of what were the big kind of issues that affected Saskatchewan. Many of them were global. The OPEC oil crisis, for example, and its effect on natural resources and the control of natural resources in Canada and in Saskatchewan, and the conflict between the Blakeney government at that time with the federal government of Pierre Trudeau, with the perceived federal intrusions into Saskatchewan and with the control of resources, and what was the political response to that in the policy sense by the Blakeney government. And in large measure, it was the use of public ownership, crown corporations, to fend off federal intrusions, because federal governments cannot tax provincial crown corporations. So you could kind of shield Saskatchewan from these federal intrusions. And this became very much what I think it created sort of the identity of the NDP government of the 1970s was really rooted in public ownership. We saw the nationalization of the potash industry. There was creation of SaskOil, the Saskatchewan Mining Development Corporations. This became really the identity of the NDP. So skipping ahead, we have the Divine Government comes to power, and about 12 years later, they go on a privatization agenda that was culminated with the privatization. And Ken, you were, I think, in the legislature in those days working. Certainly you'll remember better than I, but the privatization of the Potash Corporation in 1989 was a real pivotal event, because the nationalization of potash by the Blakeney government was seen as its sort of signature event. This really kind of defined the Blakeney government, along with the other nationalization in other resource sectors. But potash, because of its importance to Saskatchewan, was absolutely sort of critical. Anyways, the Divine Government embarks on its privatization agenda, which reverses these initiatives by the Blakeney government. And I believe at that moment, the NDP effectively lost its identity in Saskatchewan. It erased the identity of the Blakeney years, which was public ownership. And I'm talking about of resource commercial crown corporations, not the core utility corporations. And ever since, it's never been on the public agenda again. We don't hear talk of sort of renationalizing potash or uranium, but that just doesn't. It's not on the public agenda anymore. And that was such a central part of the NDP years that it's left them, I believe, without any kind of real identity. They've struggled ever since. And the rise of the Saskatchewan Party, and Linda Haverstock is here, and she knows full well how, the backstory there, where some Liberal MLAs after the 1995 election joined with some members, the few members left of the Progressive Conservative Party, to form the Saskatchewan Party, and they instantly became the official opposition just in terms of numbers. And then we get into the 1999 election, where the Romano government forms a coalition with the Liberals to stay in power, because it was a 1 or 2 seat, I think, margin, 3-seat margin, and so the Romano government made the deal with the 3 Liberals who joined government. 2 of them were in cabinet, 1 became a speaker, and you had this coalition government, which then polarized the environment in Saskatchewan. You now had 2 parties. because the Liberals essentially just disappeared. They were consumed by the NDP at that point. So you had the NDP and you had the Conservative Party. And in that kind of sort of fully polarized environment was not good for the NDP, because historically the NDP would not win in a straight binary choice like that. They often would need a third party that would bleed off some of the support on the right. And, they tend to win it with 40 or 45% of the vote. And then we get into sort of the rise of Brad Wall, who's an absolutely critical figure during this period, who in his own way had his spirit of kind of populism in his terms of his style and his communication abilities and whatnot. And I would argue that the Sask Party has run a pretty pragmatic government for the most part, certainly under Wall's period. And one of the biggest examples of that pragmatism under the Saskatchewan Party, and I would mention the Saskatchewan Party has been, a big spending government, right? They run significant deficits, often through years when resource revenues and others are very high. In spite of that, they still run significant deficits, and the provincial debt has increased under the Saskatchewan Party. But which made it very difficult for the NDP, I think, to find any kind of issues to really seize upon. They were sort of relegated to the margins, arguing about specific kind of micro issues, but there's no big issue for the NDP to seize upon. At any rate, Brad Wall's was a very, I think, effective leader, and his pragmatism, to my mind, was best sort of represented in the attempts by BHP Billiton to in a hostile takeover of the Potash Corporation of Saskatchewan. So here you had what was really going to be a market event, where you had one large publicly traded corporation, Potash Corporation of Saskatchewan, with ownership all over the world by shareholders, being purchased or attempt to be purchased by a publicly traded company with shareholders all over the world, right? I mean, normally this would just be a market transaction that happens every day. But because of potash's presence in the psychology of the province in terms of its importance to Saskatchewan, even though the Potash Corporation was no longer owned by the people of Saskatchewan, it was publicly traded, Brad Wall recognized the significance of the potential sale to an Australian company, and was seen as a defender of Saskatchewan interests, and actually argued against the market principles applying here, and was successful in creating pressure on the federal government, the Harper government, which was very much a free market type of government. And certainly Stephen Harper believed that this transaction should just go through. This is the market at work. But enough political pressure was created on the federal government that they refused the transaction to take place. Industry Canada interceded. Anyways, I just think that's an example of kind of the pragmatism that was at the core of the Wall government and its success. So, I mean, at the end of the book, I get into some of the more current times, and in the end, sort of, what does all this mean for the NDP, and is there any road back for the NDP? So that's long-winded explanation of the general trajectory of the book. And like I say, it's sort of built around what I see as moments in time that were really sort of crucial, that framed this period, this transition period, politically and economically, for the province. And if I might, I don't want to go on for too long, but I could read a few little excerpts, brief, to give you, and I wasn't sure what I should pick out. So what I'm going to do is just read a little bit from the introduction, and then I'm going to read a little bit from the chapter on populism, and then a little bit from the conclusion. So, not too much, and it's kind of hard to do it in the sense that I'm pulling things out of a much bigger story. Anyways, in the introduction, I'm talking about important periods and episodes in Saskatchewan life. And what I say is, for Saskatchewan, there are several such defining episodes. One was the early years of immigration and settlement, when the social and economic fabric of the province was established. Another era that had a powerful influence on the psychology and politics of the province was the Great Depression and drought of the 1930s. The third era was the post-Second World War years, when Saskatchewan entered a period of relative economic stability and modest growth. Those episodes in the life and development of the province certainly were all interconnected but each in its own discrete way had specific identifiable characteristics that were unique to its precise era. I believe another such period can be identified as the years from the late 1960s to the late 1990s. Although not precisely aligned, nothing ever is in the seamless unfolding of history. One can point to two provincial elections, one in 1971 and another in 1999, as political bookends that provide a framework for understanding the Saskatchewan of today. It is that particular stretch of time when major issues confronting the province were grappled with and addressed. The result was that effectively a new province emerged at the dawn of the new century. The Saskatchewan of today is far different from the province that was once seen as something of an outlier in terms of taking a different political and economic approach than others. At one time, Saskatchewan had the reputation as a place with a distinctive and somewhat unique collectivist culture. It was evident in the cooperative movement, the rise of farm organizations that sought to gather farmers in groups that enhanced their market power. Politically, it became expressed in the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, CCF, which later became the New Democratic Party. Together, they formed what was seen as a natural governing party for the province for decades. The primary example of that political culture, of course, was Saskatchewan as the pioneer of publicly funded, universally accessible health care. The implementation of a groundbreaking provincial system of Medicare in 1962 became a defining moment for the province in that it, more than anything else, shaped others' perception of Saskatchewan. To this day, 60 years later, Medicare remains for some an important symbol that is seen to reflect the province's character. But it is also true that the lingering effects of that moment in time is dissipating as a different Saskatchewan has emerged. I'll just read a bit more here. The 3-decade period that ended with the turning of the new page to a new century had within it powerful and momentous issues at the global, national, and provincial levels that altered the province in profound ways. But what unfolded in those years was not isolated to that period. The events were also a reaction to what took place before, during, and after. So for the purpose of trying to make sense of history, the period can be identified as having a beginning and an end, even though it didn't then and doesn't today. There can be little doubt that Saskatchewan has undergone a political and economic transformation in recent decades. It is most evident politically. The Saskatchewan Party, which emerged in the late 1990s as an alternative to challenge the political dominance of the NDP, has become the national governing party of the province. It has created a hegemony that includes not only complete dominance of rural Saskatchewan, but also strength in urban areas exceeding that of the NDP, which has been forced to the margins of electoral politics. The degradation of the NDP to the point that today it is no longer a seriously competitive electoral factor in much of the province, let alone the dominant force of what it once represented, is the greatest evidence of the province's transformation. In the October 2020 election, the Saskatchewan Party won its 4th consecutive majority term, only the second party in the province's history to achieve such an electoral feat. The other was the CCF, which won 5 consecutive majorities with Tommy Douglas as leader. So that's just a little bit from the introduction of this book. And I should mention, I didn't in my sort of overview, the other really critical sort of dimension in the transformation of the province has been the economic transformation of rural Saskatchewan. The emergence of an entirely changed rural economy, one that is far different from the ones of 30, 40 years ago. It's a far more, orderly marketing is now a thing of the past. The pro-rate is gone. The Canadian Wheat Board is gone. Farmers are now very much, imbued with an individualistic culture and ethic because they're engaged in their own marketing now, right, directly into the market. So all those instruments that were so important for the NDP, like the Saskatchewan Wheat Pool, and the whole notion of the family farm, which the NDP saw itself as defensive, that's all gone. And I honestly believe that the NDP has never been able to reconcile itself with that new reality. Never, and it may be my failing, but I'm unable to even begin to describe or suggest what the NDP agriculture policy is. I simply don't know. I don't think anybody else does. So that's a very important part of this story, I believe. So I'll just read you here a couple of paragraphs from the chapter on populism, and this is like an early chapter, just trying to set the stage. At the core of populism is opposition to an established and privileged power structure that reflects dominant ideas and values. Populism of the left sees the people, in quotes, in socioeconomic terms as a working class exploited by the wealthy elite. Right-wing populism often sees the people in ethno-national terms, where ethnicity determines membership in the group. In both cases, the assumed unity of the group creates antagonistic relationships with those seen as wielding power. Saskatchewan has at times been fertile ground for populism. Indeed, populism has been a recurring impulse through periods of the province's history, shaping the province politically and economically, and at other times emerging only for brief episodes around specific issues or events. And I would argue 1982 is an example of that. The good news is that populism has, for the most part, been a positive force in the public life of the province. The Saskatchewan variant has been largely contained to charismatic leadership that use the power of populism with measured discretion. In those cases, populist appeal has targeted what are considered to be the core communitarian values of Saskatchewan society, including hard work, individual initiative, perseverance, and commitment to community. In that context, populism can be a useful lens through which to understand Saskatchewan society and its politics. And I just would say on sort of this point about sort of these Saskatchewan values that I talk about. I always, and I talk about this later in the book, I think this was a key for Brad Wall's success, is that my perception always was that he would always contextualize his policy decisions in as representing Saskatchewan values. He seemed to do that a lot. So he would announce a new policy, and he would put it in the context of believing that this is reflective of what Saskatchewan people, what their values are, and he was very effective at that. And in a way, and I make this point, so he was able to depoliticize political rhetoric for political purposes. So he would talk about common values that you would hear him, express, and the average person would think, I agree with that. That makes sense, and it's seems consistent with sort of my beliefs, right? And then use that as sort of a bridge into sort of acceptance of this policy, that it was built on something that sort of some commonality between all of us. And all politicians do that or attempt to do it, but I think Wall was quite effective at it. I'll just read one last little bit near the end. This is in some ways the unfolding. So anyways, I talked about a lot in the 1970s and 80s about big issues that were going on and how that affected Saskatchewan, these external influences, global issues, national issues that had an influence on Saskatchewan politics, and how parties and governments responded to them. So they were responding to external forces, not ones so much domestic in a Saskatchewan sense. So I'm saying here, in some ways, the unfolding global and national events of today, the pandemic, a retreat from globalization, the fear of stagflation. You're hearing the word stagflation a lot these days. Well, stagflation was a huge issue, particularly in the 1970s, the one that I think became the Achilles heel of the Blakeney government, that it didn't focus on those kind of economic kinds of issues that were affecting people, and they were seen as sort of, too concerned about natural resources and crown corporations and whatnot, and average people were being really harmed at that time because of interest rates that were nearing 20% and whatnot. And they felt, the government wasn't responding. Anyways, so the fear of stagflation is back again. An unfolding energy and environment crisis, rising government debt, and regional cleavages in Canada are not unlike the major issues that politically and economically transformed the province between the late 1960s and the turn of the 21st century. At the same time, the populism that was so fundamental in shaping the province, its politics, and its destiny many decades ago still lurks below the surface. It remains both a potent and potentially dangerous force if not managed with care. At a time when division and alienation are themes that often dominate the politics of the Prairie West, the challenge for Saskatchewan's future is to ensure that its political and economic transformation does not lose sight of its past. Indeed, there surely are lessons to be drawn for all of Canada from the issues, events, and trends that shape the political and economic transformation of Saskatchewan. This is a story much bigger than a province, long seen as playing a role in shaping national politics far exceeding its status in terms of population and economy. Saskatchewan might again be at the leading edge of what unfolds politically as Canada responds to its challenges. So that's the very end of the book. Trying to make final anyways, very broad, general terms, right? And the book is like the, well, you'll see. I mean, if you pick up them and just look at it, the chapters create a bit of a roadmap of beginning and the things that I address along the way, and out of that hopefully creates a sense of how these things are all kind of interconnected and carried us to where we are today, a function of policies and people over the course of the last 50 years in Saskatchewan. So that's my story, and I'm sticking with it. And I'm glad. If anybody wants to ask any questions, feel free. Glad to. I don't know if I'll be able to answer them, but or if you got comments, just observations, agreements, disagreements, anything.
And I'll just come around with the wireless mic so that everyone on the live stream can also hear.
And this guy's actually in the book.
Dale, it's a terrific book. It's an important book. And thanks for taking time to write it, your reflections. Saskatchewan's relationship with Alberta. In 2005, I had the privilege of sharing the stage with two giants, and it was Peter Lougheed and Alan Blakeney. And I had been tasked with chairing some of the celebratory activities. They were really good friends. They had shared a lot, and began a process where I began to think about the relationship of the two provinces that were created at the same time, these twins, and how are they affecting each other in this contemporary era? And what does that look like as far as affecting not just Saskatchewan, but also Alberta?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question, Rob, and I do get into that to some degree in the book, particularly the Lougheed-Blakeney relationship, and you can see sort of parallels with today. In the 70s, when the resource struggles were going on between the province, Saskatchewan and Alberta, largely on oil, but also potash with us in terms of court cases where the federal government was intervening. Blakeney and Lougheed were allies in terms of fending off the federal government, defending provincial interests. Now they took different routes. Lougheed saw private investment, private capital as the means to develop these resources, and then used the government through royalties and taxation to defend the interests of the public's ownership of these resources. But he believed sort of the capital, the government didn't have the capital, provincial governments didn't have the amount of capital necessary to be able to develop these resources in a significant way. Blakeney, this was ideological in part, but it was also pragmatic because he was defending, he had to respond to the challenge, used crown corporations. So they used different instruments to achieve the same ends, in fact, right? And that's what made them close allies, and they both respected each other immensely. I think I quote Lougheed in this about Blakeney, how he and Blakeney, how much he admired Blakeney, how well they worked together. So that's true. Now you look ahead to today, and we've got similar federal provincial tensions, particularly between the Alberta, Saskatchewan, and the federal government, and overreach by Ottawa that the provinces feel. I get it, but what I would say about it today is there was always a tone of commitment to federalism in the Blakeney and Lougheed era, right? They were strong federalists, right? They were defenders of Canada. And I'm not saying Scott Moe and Jason Kenney are not defenders of Canada, but they're more sort of aggressive in their language against Ottawa, which then can feed this whole sort of populist sentiment that exists out there, right? Because it's all about alienating. Populism is all about alienation and being not being treated fairly by others, in this sense, the federal government. So I think there are some parallels. The styles are a lot different, and I think it's in some ways a more dangerous time now, because for all kinds of reasons. For, you know, we live in a social media world, and people, you know, you can ignite passions very easily now, and politicians have to be very cautious about that, right? I mean, you have to recognize those sentiments that are out there, but how do you manage them in a way that doesn't let it get out of control? It's a big challenge, and I certainly don't envy Scott Moe or Jason Kenney in terms of trying to deal with those things. It's very, very difficult. I don't know if that answers your question, Rob.
A question over here.
Hi, Dale. I was hoping you could indulge me in somewhat of a thought experiment here. I was quite intrigued, and I checked in the internet, so you have some stuff in the book on this. What happens to this narrative if Linda Haverstock is not forced to resign?
Well, that's, I mean, good question. I don't know, maybe you well, I mean, let's think about it for a moment. I haven't thought about it in those terms, right? Well, the problem, and Linda, you're correct, but I mean, the challenge for the Liberals at that time, there were really high expectations, and that, like, when you won more seats, right, in '95, your vote went up, but people were expecting some major breakthrough, which didn't occur, right? And I don't know, I can't talk about the internal sort of dynamics of the outcome of that. But if the Liberals had held together, there would be no Saskatchewan Party, right? And maybe Linda Haverstock or a Liberal leader would be the premier. You know, I mean, this is all just wild speculation, but that's not what happened, right? And you got to give Wall his due. Brad Wall is a tremendously capable politician, right? And he also represented kind of generational change, I think. I wasn't around when he won power, you know, but my sense is that, you know, there was fatigue with the NDP at 16 years in power or whatever, good for a change. And here's Brad Wall, who's a great communicator, quite eloquent, you know, seen as kind of a new face, so to speak, which is fit the time and the sentiment. Anyways, something else you want to follow up?
Just a quick follow-up. Sure. One of the reasons I asked was I had an elderly aunt at the time who was a lifelong Liberal, and that's when the Liberals lost their treatment of Linda.
Yeah.
And I was more curious in terms of you describing the NDP not having done well in a binary environment. If they would have stayed with, say, an effective Liberal Party, if Linda had become leader, and you would have had two and a half parties. Do you see? I'm just curious how it might have played out from your perspective.
Well, I mean, let me say that about the 1999 coalition with the Liberals, right? I mean, my perception of that, coalitions can make sense politically, right? But they got to be on the right side of history, and that wasn't, because the NDP was in decline, right? And this was a clear determination by the NDP to cling to power, to do this sort of coalition. And, you know, the public will perceive that as resisting the change that was underway, right? Of trying to, you know, somehow ignore the will of the people, to put it in kind of stark terms. Yeah, coalition governments that happen when the change is that feeds the change that's underway, that's reflective of the change, right? Can work well, but this was just the opposite. So there was that, and also the fact that the Liberals just disappeared as an entity in the province. So we're now in this polarized world where the NDP are not going to do well. Historically, they never have, right? There's, you know, the interesting thing about Saskatchewan politics too is how conservative voters. I remember having a conversation with Dick Culver many years ago in the 1980s for a different book I was writing. He was living in Phoenix, and I was down there talking with him about this thing. And his theory on Saskatchewan politics, you may have heard this at some point. You know, we're talking about conservatives who vote federally, voters who vote conservative federally in Saskatchewan and NDP provincially. And he said, well, it's not hard to understand. He said, look, for the first 30 years of Saskatchewan history, there were the Liberals and the Conservatives. Then in 1933, there were the Liberals and the CCF. Not hard to figure out where the CCF came from, right? And I think there's truth to that, right? And we saw it over many years where, you had the Diefenbaker government sweeping rural Saskatchewan, conservatives, and then a year later, provincial government, Tommy Douglas sweeping rural Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan people are at their core conservative people, particularly in rural Saskatchewan. And this gets into all other things that got in here where the NDP completely failed to understand rural Saskatchewan. And the biggest blunder was the land bank, right? Which, was completely contrary to kind of the ethic of rural Saskatchewan and the farm population, which was immigrants came to Canada to own their own land, right? This was absolutely fundamental to them. And now you got a government coming along saying, well, we're going to buy up this farmland as a way to sort of intergenerational transfer, but it stayed in government's hands, right? Made people very uncomfortable. And I think that was very damaging this in the 70s to the NDP in rural Saskatchewan.
So I think just in the interest of time, so we've got lots of time for you to sign books.
Okay.
We'll just move the rest of the Q&A more informal, and I think you're gonna stick around and sign books for us.
Yeah. Signatures are free.
Oh, perfect. Yes, we've got lots of stock. You're more than welcome to get your book signed before you purchase them. And yeah, thank you all for coming. Huge thanks to Dale Eisler, and for anyone who is tuning in from home. Yes, take care, everyone.
I appreciate everybody coming out on a weeknight like this. It's good to see you. So
During the playoffs.
yeah, I know. Yeah. What's the score? Anybody know the score?
I don't know.
The Leafs are playing again.
I know.
Yeah. Not that I care about the Leafs.
Computer sign?
He's gonna be desk.